Beyond the Desert Gate, Chapter 6, The Reckoning. Bum, bum, bum. Philo brought Nicanor back at the hour when the last color had left the sky, and Cousin Cherries came with them. They found Conan already sitting in the dining room with Uncle Menelaus, Paulinus, and 2 other merchants. Zenos was in the corner of the room with his head bent. In the pauses in the conversation, they could hear the sobbing of the kitchen girl in the far courtyard. Conan was composed now, feeling unreal as if he was acting a part. He had heard himself greet Paulinus and the others and discuss what rites it would be possible to carry out for his father, as there was no chance of the body being found. Then there was a pause. Philo seemed completely exhausted, as he well might be, and Nicanor had hardly spoken. Already weary himself, Conan had no idea how he was going to cope with his brother after the men had gone, for he could sense that of all the difficulties that faced the family, this would be the worst. Their father's death was one fact that even Nicanor could not make go away by ignoring it. But the men showed no signs of going either, and Paulinus was even trying to talk business. "You know that your father borrowed some considerable sums of money from me before he left. Is it too soon to be sure? It is too soon to be sure, of course, but it would seem that what he took with him must be counted as utterly lost. This will put us all in an awkward position." Philo, watching his brother's strained face, wondered if Paulinus wanted his money that very evening. It all began to feel more dreamlike. Conan twitched, as if he had been asleep almost, and drew himself upright. "Gentlemen, in the morning we must make the offerings for my father. After that, noble Paulinus, it would be a kindness if you could collect together an account of all that my father owed, and when we have the amount before us, we can arrange for its payment." "But, my boy," twittered the old uncle. Conan silenced him and surprised the others by standing up. Reluctantly, Paulinus and the merchants rose with him and then found themselves being ushered out to the gate. Conan walked back slowly to the dining room. Cousin Cherries was still sitting miserably next to old Menelaus. He was a big man with a face the color of a Roman brick. "Conan, what will you do?" he asked. "You know how I'm placed. Since I've lost the mares, I haven't 2 coins to rub together. I can't sell the farm. As for Nicanor, there's always work for him, since my own boy died. But more than that, 3 of you, do you know what the debt will be?" His hands were rubbing together helplessly. Conan caught his younger brother's eye, and Nicanor jerked himself up from a pit of silence. "We all know you'll do what you can, cousin. Don't worry. Now, can you get back to the farm tonight? It's very late." The big man got up awkwardly and looked around him at the shabby, comfortable room. "Perhaps I should stay with you." "Cousin, it's the 54th night since our father left us. We're used to being alone," said Conan quietly. It was arranged that Cherries would spend the night with the old uncle, but while Nicanor was seeing them out, Philo said, "But you know, the house does feel more empty. We always knew before, or we hoped—" He could not finish, but Zenos understood. He got up slowly and went out into the dark courtyard. Conan and Nicanor were standing by the gate, and Lucia came through from the kitchen, shielding the tiny lamp in her hands from the chilly night wind. "I've got that silly girl quiet, I think. Now, my poor boys, you must rest yourselves. Come on now, Philo. You're dropping on your feet. Go to bed." "But Zenos, what are we going to do? Shouldn't we try to make a plan?" "Do what Lucia says," he said gently. "What can you decide tonight? You must rest, even if you can't sleep. I've been watching and thinking. Tomorrow, this first day at least will be behind you." He turned into his own doorway. Conan saw Philo standing, drooping and uncertain. He put an arm round his shoulders. "Come on, then. We don't any of us want to be alone. You can come in with me as long as you don't kick." Xenos, lying fully dressed on his bed, heard their voices for a little longer, and then the house was quiet. He knew that it would be a long time before he slept himself. He tried to calculate in his mind what the contents of the house were worth, the beasts, the last of the stock from Apollodorus's journey. There was probably some of his wife's jewelry, too, waiting to be given as a gift to Conan's bride. Xenos noticed that he still seemed to know what things were worth. Everything would depend on the important figure that Paulinus would bring to them the next day. But even after the debts were met, what would the boys live on? Cherries had been right to see the difficulty there. Nicanor seemed for once to be luckiest of the three. School would have to stop for Philo, and how would Conan occupy himself in so small a city where he had always till now had money and position as well as his good looks? They must, if at all possible, keep the house, but could they afford to live there? He dozed and woke up and dozed again, and then, as the first cocks of Philadelphia crying into the still black sky broke again into his shallow sleep, the stirrings of an idea came to him. Philo woke first in the room where the boys were sleeping together. Only a wan grayness showed in the sky, and the cover had slipped further than he could reach. Conan lay half across him, still asleep. They had crowded two to a bed, as they had when he was very small and afraid of the dark, seeking what comfort there was in physical nearness. But it had been Nicanor who had cried himself to sleep under the covers, hoping that the others couldn't hear. Philo felt his own head ache now with unshed tears. He managed to ease himself from under Conan's spread arm. It sounded as if someone was stirring. As he went out into the strange gray light, Xenos was standing in his doorway. "Is Conan awake?" he asked quietly. "He wasn't just now." Philo turned back into the room and saw that Conan's eyes were open. He beckoned to him, glancing across at the sleeping hump of Nicanor. The light was strong enough now for them to see each other's faces as they huddled side by side on Xenos' bed. "Conan, I think you may have to think quickly and see clearly, or you will find yourselves forced into accepting help you don't want. Do you understand that?" I know I'd rather be miserable doing something I've chosen than sit meekly in Paulinus's warehouse and be grateful for every meal I ate," said Conan. "I thought you might feel like that. Now, do you know what the most valuable possession you have is?" Then Xenos' heart ached because Conan had looked at once at his youngest brother. "No," he thought, "after your family." Aloud he said, "This house. It's well situated, better than many in the city. The stables are good. If you let it out, you would have enough to live on, enough for you three." "And Lucia," said Philo. "Yes, and Lucia. Old Adius and the two girls are slaves. You'll have to sell them." "Sorry?" "And there must be room for you." From Philos, Xenos would have expected it, but not from Conan, and he was so moved that for the moment he was speechless. Oh, I used Philo's voice, but it was supposed to be Conan. You probably caught that. My bad. "You can't leave us now, not yet, even if your memory comes back today and your strength with it," said Conan urgently. "You wouldn't, would you? You're right about the house. I suppose it is the one way out, but where would we live ourselves?" "There are storerooms off the yard. We wouldn't need much space, if only we didn't have to go all together. I don't think I could bear going..." I'm messing these voices all up, y'all. I think this is Philo, so let me start that little paragraph again. "There are storerooms off the yard. We wouldn't need much space, if only we didn't have to go all together. I don't think I could bear to go on living in Philadelphia and pass the door of this house and know there were only strangers here," said Philo. "But who would they be? Who in Philadelphia could afford to live here?" asked Conan. "I don't know, but we mustn't try to go too fast. By tonight, we'll be seeing things more clearly," said Xenos. Philo went back into his room next door and dressed slowly. He remembered the rites for his father and put on his best tunic, and then had to hunt for his newest sandals. He had hardly worn them, but they were already almost too small. He sat down on the bed that had not been slept in and looked around the room, almost as if when he left it that morning he would not be coming back. It would be easier if he could be like that and not drawn out as he knew it must be. He felt heavy and cold and already tired, with an ache in his heart that went on dully like a toothache. He was still trying to make himself think of what lay ahead as just something unpleasant that had to be gone through, like having the aching tooth pulled, not anything to do with a father whom he had loved and who would now never stride through the gate again. That second day was the worst, with the funeral offerings and the procession of callers, and then Paulinus with his tablets and his good advice. When he had gone and the figure was known, Conan and Zenos went round the house, checking and making lists. The day after that, like a gift from the gods, Timon of Gerasa arrived, their father's friend, and it was he who saw to the selling of the slaves for them, and who himself, in memory of Apollodoros, bought what they could not easily get rid of in Philadelphia. More could not be expected him. When there was something practical to do, Nicanor was helpful enough, but he made no suggestions and seemed not quite to understand where all Conan's plans were leading. It was on the 7th day, when Timon ridden north again, that the final decision could be delayed no longer. The dining room furniture had gone, and so they sat on the beds in the boys' room, with Lucia in the chair Conan had kept because it was easy for her stiff knees, waiting for Conan, who had been out on important business. When his brother came in, Philo noticed that for the first time since their father's death, there was a little color in his face. He had been hurrying, and that could only mean he had been successful. It was difficult to know whether to be glad or not. "Zenos, you were right. They're coming to look anyway," Conan said, throwing himself down on the bed. "Who's coming?" asked Nicanor, suddenly suspicious, and raising himself from his lethargy. "Nico, I didn't tell you before because I knew it would upset you, and there was no point if it wasn't going to happen. You know, we've discussed it, that we have to let the house. It's all right for you. You can go back to the farm, but we, the rest of us, have got to have somewhere to live." "I know you have. I'm not stupid. But do you know how difficult it is to find someone to take the house with the war on and things so difficult? Well, I suppose it's only because of the war that Zenos, that is, had the idea." "What's the idea?" Nicanor looked suspiciously across at Zenos. As the days had passed, his awkwardness with the man had grown less, but he still kept away from him as much as possible, even though the burns were fading. "I've just been down to the Roman camp. No, let me finish. We thought there was a strong chance they might soon need somewhere more comfortable to use as an officer's mess when they had visitors, something like that. There are often high-ranking officers passing through. There's a tribune in charge, left behind because he's recovering from a leg wound. I was taken to him. He liked the sound of the house, and they're coming tomorrow to look." Nicanor rose up slowly. "You mean Romans? Here in these rooms while you sleep in a store shed?" Suddenly furious, Philo shouted, "Where are we to sleep then? In a stable with you? Even Lucia? What did you think was going to happen? Have you got a better idea? We haven't had any suggestions from you so far, all the time when Conan and Zenos have been working so hard." "Zenos? Why pretend it's Conan's idea? Very well, I understand now. I won't live under the same roof with a Roman. You never thought I would, did you? If this is your way of trying to get rid of me, it's worked. I don't expect you'll need to know where to find me, but you do, to start with anyway." He was already on his feet. Now he turned and pulled down his cloak from the wall and began to pile tunics and old sandals onto it. Lucia got up and went to him. "Nicanor, please don't. Let me do that. Don't go off like this. Think what your father would have wanted." At that, Nicanor started crying.
but he would not stop what he was doing. Philo watched him, frozen with shock and distress, while he fastened his bundle and ran out into the courtyard without saying goodbye. The front gate slammed shut. Then the house was very quiet. Lucia, whom none of them could ever remember having seen cry, sat down heavily with the tears running down her face. "Let me go away, Conan. I've got friends in the city. One of them would take me. You're only doing this for me. Don't let him go like that." Conan went to her and took her hands. "Dear Lucia, no. You're part of our family, and while one of us is left in Philadelphia, you live with us. Let's hear no more of that. It isn't why Nicanor ran away, because that is what he's doing. I don't like Romans either, but what does he want me to do? Hire myself out as a donkey boy? Zeno said the first night that we had to see things clearly. The difference is that Philo and I want to try, and Nicanor won't even try." The words had been said, and they were true, but that did not make the pain any easier. Philo went quietly away and began to move the first of his things through into the storage yard. Lucia and Zenos followed him, and Conan was left alone to look at his brother's deserted bed. Next morning, the Romans came. Philo reported to Lucia, who was keeping out of sight in the kitchen. "They're on the far side, looking at the stables now." Lucia looked up from the onions she was peeling. "Do they look pleased?" I think so. The Tribune's here. He has black hair, and I think he's the one Conan saw with father on the first day when the legate came. And there's a centurion who looks fat and bad-tempered, and a clerk who's writing everything down. Oh, he's writing down everything Conan says." "I thought your uncle was supposed to be showing them round?" "Yes, he's there, but I don't think he was doing it very well, so Conan took over. It was partly his idea." The sound of voices outside moved back into the main courtyard, and Philo went back toward the steps. Although it was still morning, the house had an afternoon hush about it. The bareness and tidiness already belonged to somewhere that was not being lived in. There was a pile of bundles already carried through and waiting to be arranged, but the stables opposite were empty, and there was no bustle from the servants or distant humming as the kitchen girl washed the flagstones in the dining room. Suddenly he was afraid to go down to the empty rooms where he had lived all his life. Conan came up through the archway, carrying a cage with Lucia's singing bird. "We forgot him. He was hanging in the colonnade, and the Tribune noticed. Yes, they're coming. We're going to keep this side of the yard and have a fence put up so we won't be stared at. Come, help me move the beds." By evening it was all done. There were 2 rooms, a small one for Lucia with a lean-to outside where she could cook, and a larger one with 2 beds, one for Conan and Philo, and the other for Zenos. They were crowded with bundles. The walls were only roughly plastered, and there was hardly room for Zenos to set up his copying table, but they were still home, and with winter upon them, at least they could keep each other warm. As Philo carried the last basket through from the courtyard, he heard the sound of people passing outside in the road and the shrilling of flutes. It was possibly a wedding, but echoing in the empty courtyard, the music was thin and eerie, more like a funeral, the funeral they had not been able to give his father. And with that sound, it seemed that the end came to the childhood he had spent in the house. Next morning, Conan hired 2 men to put up the fence in the storeyard. The ground was iron hard, and by the time they had dug the post holes, the little rooms were gritty with dust, and the Romans had arrived. Loud voices from the front of the house and strange horses being led through the back gate into the stables. Zenos kept out of the way, although he knew that there was no chance that with his scarred face he would be recognized by anyone who had seen him in the desert. After he had welcomed the Tribune, Conan went out, certain that he had done what was best for the family, and yet hating to see and hear it happen. When he came back late in the afternoon, Philo was on his hands and knees trying to get the fire to go. He sat back on his heels with a smudge of dirt across his cheek and grinned. "I've got a job." "You've what?" Conan noticed it was the first time since the 54th day that he had seen his younger brother smile. "I'm going to work for the Tribune, Marcus Gallienus, for the Romans. I went and asked, and he looked me up and down and said they needed a boy to run errands who knew the city and to wait the table. At least I shall get my meals." Zenos, hearing what was going on and coming to the doorway, saw Conan go red with anger. "Steady," he said. "If things had worked out badly, and there hadn't been enough money even if you'd sold the house, you might have been slaves by now, both of you, and doing worse things than serving at a table." It was true, and that truth was so appalling that Conan felt himself go cold and his anger drain away. "Sorry," he said. "That was clever of you, Philo, and good luck to you. I suppose I'm jealous. At least you'll have something to do." He went through into their room and began to stack his belongings more tidily. Zenos, looking after him, gave him a little while on his own. It had been so quick. Only that summer, the boy had been a law student. Now, he was envying his brother a servant's job. Yet, thank the gods for Philo, he had loved his father deeply, and this loss could have crushed him utterly, and yet now he was blowing up the fire again and making jokes with Lucia. He was the youngest, and young trees bend more easily to the wind. But it was something more than that. It was too early yet to see clearly what this upturning of their lives would do to each of the sons of Apollodorus, but the beginning, at least, was plain.